Audiobook Academy. Book Summary. The Last Days of Socrates. By Plato. In the last days of Socrates, Plato and Socrates' philosophical debates are examined. Sections include Euthyphro, the Apology, Crito, and Phaedo. The great philosopher and poet of his time, Socrates was never one to leave a written record of his lessons. After his trial and forced suicide, his student Plato transcribed Socrates' statements exactly as he remembered them from when he was the man's pupil. In 469 BC, in the Greek city of Athens, Socrates was born. Socrates had a difficult time deciding on a career path because his father was a sculptor and his mother was a midwife. Plato portrays him as a man of strong religious convictions and high moral standards in his work. Young nobles often sought him out as a tutor so they could compete with him on knowledge. To discover the answers to the questions he was unable to provide. As a result of this, he was tried and found guilty, and he was put to death. However, Plato was simply one of the young Athenians who aspired to study and admire his mentor's thoughts. In order to keep Socrates alive and restore his reputation, Plato used the earliest draft of Socrates' teachings that had been widely disseminated. The Apology and Crito were born out of this need. For dramatic purposes, Euthyphro is the book's first chapter, but it was written later. However, the Apology incorporates imagined dialogue, but is not written in that manner. Supposedly, Socrates delivered a series of speeches during his trial. In the Crito, he explains to friends why he didn't flee after he was convicted. Because of their deceit, the guys who testified against them are to blame for his conviction. An account of the charges brought against Socrates can be found in Plato's Euthyphro. Socrates' final days and death are recounted in the Phaedo. Wrapping things up is the primary purpose of the conclusion. The Last Days of Socrates is one of Plato's most enduring and influential works, and it continues to be studied in philosophy courses around the world. Because of his dedication to preserving his teacher's words, he was able to preserve both of them for tens of thousands of years. On the porch of King Archon, one of the judges tasked with overseeing religious law, Socrates meets a seer and religious expert by the name of Euthyphro. The trial for Socrates is about to begin. Euthyphro is there to file a homicide complaint against his own father. This surprises Socrates. They then examine piety and its genuine nature. Asking what Socrates is doing, Euthyphro inquires of him. Athenians are accusing him of infiltrating their young and creating a new deity. At this point in the conversation, Socrates sarcastically remarks that Meletus has made an excellent start in ridding the city's young men of corruptors. Because Euthyphro says he is frequently visited by a divine sign, as he is on occasion, the accusations are undoubtedly based on this. He assures them that everything would be all right if they are patient with these biases. When Socrates confronts Euthyphro about his visit to the king, Euthyphro claims he is there to bring a murder complaint against the king. Unless the murderer is a close family member or friend, Socrates believes that he would not want to punish his own father for the crime. In spite of Euthyphro's insistence that the victim was not a family member or close friend, he feels compelled to disclose the crime because it involves his father. Euthyphro's day laborer was the victim. That's what happened after drinking too much. He used a knife to slay yet another co-worker. His father had the man tied up and dumped in a ditch while he awaited action from the appropriate authorities. He perished of malnutrition and exposure since his father had forgotten about him. He claims his family doesn't comprehend why he's going to court over the murder of their patriarch. I don't get it, neither does Socrates. Euthyphro quips sarcastically to Socrates that he wishes he could teach him about religion. So when Meletus accuses him of not knowing religion, he may inform him that he is under the tutelage of Euthyphro and to see him. Euthyphro doesn't notice the sarcasm and accepts the proposal. Even Meletus would have no chance against him because he is an expert in religious matters. Taking things a little more seriously, Socrates asks Euthyphro to help him distinguish between the sacred and the profane. To keep the conversation on track, Socrates nudges Euthyphro away from a discussion of Zeus. Socrates asks for a basic definition of holy and a criteria by which it might be judged, as well as an example. Euthyphro's father is being prosecuted by his son Euthyphro since the gods rarely agree on anything. They then discuss the distinction between being accepted and being accepted. Seeing as Euthyphro's argument about holiness being something authorized by the gods no longer holds water, Socrates asks him to repeat it. It's difficult to follow Euthyphro's accusation that Socrates talks about the same things over and over again. While Euthyphro's answers are circular, Socrates maintains that all he did was ask questions. In the next question, Socrates asks, "Is everything that is just holy?" Socrates asks Euthyphro what he means when he argues that the element of justice concerned with looking after the gods is holy. It's good for the horse to have a groom looking after it. Asked by Socrates, does doing nice deeds serve the gods? What do the gods want to accomplish with the existence of humans? Euthyphro becomes irritated and sums it up for Socrates by adding that they pay homage to the gods with offerings, and the gods satisfy their wishes. Suddenly Euthyphro remembers an appointment and hurries away from Socrates as he tries to bring the topic back to what is sacred and what the gods accept. Socrates is concerned about the approaching trial and calls after him. The apology. In light of the accuser's previous warnings that Socrates is a skilled speaker who will confuse the judges, Socrates begins by dispelling that notion and claiming that, unlike his accusers, he will tell the truth, but that he will attempt to avoid using his regular conversational manner in the hearing. He begs the court to focus on the content of his arguments rather than the rhetorical flourishes. To determine whether or not what he claims is true. Apologia in Greek translates to defense, so it's not the kind of apology we're used to. I am on trial because I embarrassed reputed wise folks with my questions, Socrates declares. Since the Delphine prophet claimed that he was the wisest man, he has attempted to demonstrate that the only reason he might be thus is because he knows nothing. He is allowed to question Meletus, the man who accused him. As a result, rather than challenging him, Socrates mocks him. By a razor-thin margin, he is convicted. Therefore, when asked what punishment he considers to be just, Socrates opposes both exile and incarceration. Instead, he suggests a filling supper in recognition of his role in arousing their awareness of injustice. His demeanor changes, and he offers to make amends. A 70-year-old man is sentenced to death after the jury rejects this argument. That there is no life after death doesn't bother him in the slightest. He says he'll just go to sleep. There's a good chance he'll talk to both Homer and Odysseus if one exists. To say goodbye, he said, now it is time that we were both departing, I would die and you would live, but whether of us would be happier is unknown to everyone but God. Crito. Socrates is imprisoned for approximately a month because he was sentenced to death on a vacation. This may have been done on purpose so that he could get away. Friends question him when he chooses against it. His friend Crito is seated right next to Socrates as he wakes up in his cell. The rest of Crito's and Socrates' friends are worried as well. As soon as the holiday is over, they expect him to be executed. This will happen in 3 days, according to Socrates. He begs Socrates to let him assist in his escape, and Socrates complies. People would accuse Crito of being selfish if he doesn't help Socrates, if the latter rejects. He accuses Socrates of forsaking his sons and friends who are in need of him. Socrates denies this. According to Socrates, planning his escape is not an act of justice or honor. A violation of the terms of his agreement with the state will occur if he escapes. As for exile, he stated that he would sooner die than accept it during his trial, therefore he cannot change his mind and accept it now. Regardless of the fact that the laws aren't working in his favor, he won't let that stop him from obeying them. He would be a horrible role model for the youth he was accused of corrupting if he ran for office. In the end, Crito accepts Socrates' choice and departs. Phaedo. The philosopher Phaedo was present during the final days of Socrates' life and witnessed his death. Socratic admirer Socrates is Phaedo's friend and fellow philosopher. His friend, Phaedo, tells him that he was one of the first people to witness Socrates' death. To know what happened, Socrates wants him to inform him. Plato wasn't there, but a few friends and his wife and one of his sons were there. Upon seeing his wife's deteriorating condition, he summoned Crito and had him remove her from the chamber. To reassure his companions, Socrates tells them that a philosopher should not be afraid of death. He believes that in the afterlife, he will be reunited with even finer companions and deities. Furthermore, philosophers spend their lives preparing for death by removing themselves from the distractions of their bodies in order to attain wisdom. As a result, death can only be beneficial to philosophers, as it separates the spirit from the body. Following the argument of opposites, Socrates goes on to explain it. It follows from this that if death is the opposite of life, then living is the opposite of death. Because of this, everything that perishes is resurrected. Socrates believes that his soul will remain in limbo for a brief period of time before seeking a new host. Another of Socrates' views is brought up by Cebes, one of Socrates' companions who is there. According to the theory of recollection, all knowledge is stored in the brain as memories. According to Socrates, new information can be linked to previously learned facts. Socrates proceeds to explain his theory of forms to the audience. When it comes to the form of equality, it doesn't matter whether two objects appear to be equal from one perspective but unequal from another. The only way we can know that equality exists is because our soul knew it from a previous life, according to Socrates, because there are no examples of equality in nature. Further, he claims that we forget these forms at birth and have to relearn them. Socrates' friends Cebes and Simmias, despite agreeing with him on his forms, claim that he hasn't shown that there is life after death. The theory of recollection demonstrates that the soul existed before birth, and the argument of opposites proves that the soul was born from death. As a result, the two men are obliged to confess that the soul survives the physical death of the body. To argue that the soul is immortal, invisible, encompassing, and consistent, Socrates uses the forms. The body, on the other hand, is physical, mortal, composed, and visible. A philosopher, on the other hand, has already strengthened his soul by spending his life searching for solutions to problems about the body and its comforts. As a result, Socrates is confident that his soul will depart from his body before it decomposes. As Cebes and Simmias argue quietly to the side, Socrates looks on. When he asks them what they're talking about, they reply they don't want to bother him. This is funny. He says to involve me in your debate. Neither of them accepts Socrates' claim that there is an afterlife for the soul. Body and spirit are compared to musical instruments by Simmias. While the strings produce the sound, they represent the soul, while the stings represent the body. What if the spirit and body of a person are also destroyed when you destroy a musical instrument? Once Cebes' argument has been presented, Socrates promises to respond. As though the soul and body were cloaks created by a tailor, Cebes compared them. As long as a tailor wears his final cloak, it will continue to be worn after his death. He acknowledges that the soul may be transferred during life and death, but eventually the soul will degrade and perish. The soul, he claims, is not impermanent. Phaedo tells Socrates that the conversation with Socrates' companions had a depressing effect on them. It's clear that Socrates shares Simmias' point of view and admits that he finds the hypothesis compelling. After that, it returned to the chamber with Socrates and the audience. As the crowd gathers around, Socrates begins to calm their nerves. He begins by responding to Simmian's claim. To compare with the melody of a stringed instrument, which can only be played once an instrument has been created and a string plucked, is impossible given Simmian's acceptance of the soul and the body theory. Another argument he makes is that whereas an instrument's ability to produce sound is dependent on its shape and condition, the soul's power to do good is not. Simmian finally gives up. The first thing Socrates says in response to Cebes' question is on the scientific processes he learned about as a kid. Anaxagoras, a well-known natural scientist, employed these strategies. However, young Socrates learned that Anaxagoras' techniques raised more problems than they answered about destruction and regeneration. Instead of coming up with actual answers, he now formulates speculations and accepts the most plausible one. In the theory of forms, he demonstrates that beauty, goodness, and magnitude can all be found. In order to persuade Cebes, Socrates claims that these views can explain cause and show immortality. Wonderful things are beautiful because of their beauty. Largeness is also a factor in the size and magnitude of larger things, while the relative smallness of smaller things also plays a role. Using the theory of forms, Socrates says, you can choose the best logical theory and stick with it. It is important not to confuse the two. The height of Simmias serves as an example of Socrates' idea. While taller than Socrates, Simmias is considerably shorter than Phaedo. Simmias, on the other hand, is both small and tall. Socrates chimes in here to say that he agrees with Socrates on this point. Socrates and his companions are back in the spotlight. He maintains that being tall is a given. While short people can become taller, the reverse is not true. The shape of certain things never changes. Despite the fact that there are degrees of cold and hot, the snow and the fire are always the same temperature. Cold isn't always snow and heat isn't always fire. Also, snow can never admit heat and remain snow, and fire can never admit cold and remain fire. Because a log can never get hot without fire, it took part in the process of generating heat in this way. As a follow-up, Socrates describes the forms of threes: oddness, evenness, and oddness. The number 3 is an odd one out if you have 3 pencils. Removing a pencil ends its participation in threeness and oddness, but allows it to participate in evenness. It is impossible for the pencils to become equal unless they quit being 3 and change their nature. Further, according to Socrates, life is brought into being any time the soul enters a physical body. The soul, by virtue of its connection to life, is unable to accept the polar opposite, namely, death. At one point, Socrates and Cebes had the following discussion: "So tell me, what must be present within the body in order for it to be alive?" "Soul. That which does not accept death is called what?" "Immortal." "And what about the soul?" "No." "Then the soul is eternal," he continues. "Indeed, it will live forever." According to Socrates, because the soul is eternal and is inseparably linked to the body, when the body dies, the soul is free to depart. Cebes gives birth. Due to the fact that the soul is eternal, we must keep in mind that the choices we make in this life have repercussions in the next. In the same way, if the soul is not held accountable, then the wicked cannot be held responsible for their actions. They just run away and end up being killed in the process. How does Socrates know that Earth is round and a lot larger than people think? He explains. He also discusses the Earth's atmosphere and how it appears from above. Tartarus, the huge river running through Earth, and Oceanus, the ocean that surrounds the Earth, are among the myths he imparts to them. Purgatory is a place where individuals are punished for their past misdeeds, whereas heaven is a place reserved for those who have either atoned for their transgressions or have paid the price and repented. It's not all bad news. Socrates tells them about heaven, too. In order to save them the trouble of cleaning him up afterward, Socrates is prepared to take his poison. During Crito's question, Socrates replies he doesn't care about how he'll be laid to rest, since his soul won't be present in his body when he dies, thus it's not him. A reluctant officer administers the poison to him after his bath. After that, the cop breaks down and walks away in tears. The philosopher Socrates argues with Crito that he has no dread of death and refuses to wait. His pleasant demeanor masks his fear of drinking hemlock, and after a brief prayer to the gods, he downs the poison. Everyone bursts into tears at this point. They're not crying for him, they're crying for themselves. They are mourning the loss of a close companion. He tells them that he sent the women away because he didn't want them to cry. Socrates wanders about a bit to speed things up for his companions. After that, he retires to his room and closes the door behind him. The last words he utters are, "Crito, I believe we should present Asclepius with a cock. Ensure that you don't forget about it." When Phaedo comes to the end of his story, we can state with confidence that he was the bravest, wisest, and most upright man we know in our time. Such, as Socrates, was the end of our buddy. To put it another way, he's about to be put to death because he's accused of creating his own deities to worship instead of following existing gods and indoctrinating his students with his philosophy. When the courts rule in his favor, he stands by them even if they are unjust. Plato and Aristotle are the founders of Western philosophy, along with Socrates. In 339 AD, he was living in Athens, Greece. He is praised for both his ethics and his philosophy. When a friend of Socrates inquired of the oracle of Delphi as to whether or not there was any man wiser than Socrates, the oracle responded in the negative. With this remark, Socrates began questioning all the intelligent persons he could locate, including politicians and clergymen. With a series of questions that bordered on sarcasm, he was able to demonstrate his opponent's lack of knowledge. Socrates found out that the oracle thought he was the most wise because he was not scared to confess that he didn't know anything he was speaking about. The Socratic method, named after Socrates, is a questioning technique used to elicit an admission of guilt, a shift in perspective, or the emergence of a previously unsuspected insight in students. When a friend of Socrates inquired of the oracle of Delphi if there was anyone wiser than Socrates, the oracle declared emphatically that there was none. Socrates began questioning all the smart men he could locate, including politicians and church leaders, in order to find out the veracity of this pronouncement. He was able to demonstrate their ignorance by a series of sarcastic inquiries that made a lot of powerful adversaries of him. Socrates realized that the oracle thought he was the wisest because he wasn't scared to confess that he didn't know anything he was speaking about. The Socratic method, named after Socrates, is a questioning technique used to elicit an admission of guilt, a shift in perspective, or the emergence of a previously unsuspected insight in students. Son of sculptor and midwife, Socrates, he served as a citizen soldier or hoplite. He married and had 2 boys after that. He became a teacher after that. Plato, among others, held him in high regard as a teacher. It was left to his students to record Socrates' ideas. Meletus, Socrates' main accuser. Despite being the group's youngest accuser, Socrates was picked as the group's spokesperson. He was undoubtedly enraged by Socrates' criticism of poets, as he was one himself. As a result, Meletus was presumably a fervent believer in God. Despite the fact that he had a well-crafted statement to air his grievances against Socrates, the latter humiliated him under cross-examination. Euthyphro, a friend Socrates meets in front of the courthouse. Upon arrival, Euthyphro intends to charge his father with manslaughter in the death of his mother. Religious piety and family responsibilities are discussed in a philosophical debate. Crito, an old friend of Socrates. It is while they are waiting for Socrates' execution that he meets with him in his cell. For the sake of his safety, he offers to pay the bribes and set up the safe house. He asks Socrates for help. Crito is also present at his death. When Socrates' wife becomes overly emotional, he removes her and assists him in taking a final bath. Phaedo, the narrator of the section involving the deathbed scenes. Phaedo tells Socrates, a fellow philosopher he encounters at a pub, the story of Socrates' death. To pay tribute to Socrates, he penned a Socratic discussion, but it has since vanished. Plato, a Greek philosopher, is regarded as one of the West's most important and innovative philosophers. Plato was born to a wealthy family in Athens, Greece, around 428 BC. Ariston, his father, was claimed to be a descendant of the early Athens monarchs. Solon's mother, Perictione, was a direct descendant of the 6th century BC politician. Plato's father died when he was a youngster, and his mother married Pyrilampus, a friend of Pericles. After becoming disenchanted with Athens' ruling class as a young man, Plato gave up his political aspirations. Eventually, he accepted Socrates' ideology and teaching method as his own and devoted himself to learning from the philosopher. He witnessed Socrates' execution in 399 BC when the Athens democracy put him to death. He may have fled Athens for Italy out of fear for his own safety. As the first European university, Plato's Academy in Athens was established in 387 BC. Astronomy, biology, mathematics and political theory were only few of the subjects covered by the school. The most well-known student at the academy was Aristotle. In 367 BC, Plato traveled to Sicily to teach Dionysius the Younger, the new ruler of Syracuse, how to rule logically. However, the experiment failed. Re-entering Sicilian politics failed once more for Plato, who visited Syracuse in 361 BC. Writing and lecturing at the academy occupied his final years. He was 80 when he died in Athens in 348 or 347 BC. The works of Plato were written as dialogues. In a conversation or debate involving two or more people, philosophical topics were discussed, debated, and debated. Plato's 35 conversations and 13 letters are included in an ancient collection. Throughout the history of philosophy, Plato's effect has been so great that it is impossible to quantify. The philosopher Speusippus, who died in 339 BC, was named head of the academy after his death. After Justinian I, the Byzantine emperor, shut it down in AD 529 because he objected to what he considered were the school's pagan beliefs. Florence's 15th-century Florentine Academy was the principal source of Platonic influence during the Renaissance. Academics in the academy focused on Plato's works in their original Greek translations. The Cambridge Platonists, a group led by Ralph Cudworth, were responsible for reviving Platonism in England during the 17th century. Since Plato's time, he has had an impact on the modern world. Thank you for listening in Audiobook Academy. Don't forget to subscribe and smash that like button for more content like this. See you in next video.